TNF-alpha inhibitors are a group of drugs used to treat auto-inflammatory diseases like inflammatory bowel disease and ankylosing spondylitis. In this visual mnemonic, we'll learn about the key TNF-alpha inhibitors so you'll be ready for test day. We're at the Surrealism exhibit in the Pixarized Museum of Modern Art. And just when we were wondering what could go wrong in such a beautiful museum, a careless visitor happened to flick her cigarette on the ground, starting a fire in the museum. Yikes! By the way, this flicking motion should remind you of Infliximab. You know, a flick for Infliximab? Infliximab is the first drug we'll talk about today. Before we get too far into the weeds, though, let's introduce the other drug names you need to know. In any Surrealism exhibit, you need to have some works by the king of Surrealism, Salvador Dali, right? Yep, you can even see Dali's famous work with the melting clocks here, The Persistence of Memory. Maybe Dali didn't know it, but his title, The Persistence of Memory, definitely has a deeper meaning. Yep, this Dali painting should help you remember the drug name Adalimumab. Get it? Dali for Adalimumab? Next, any famous work like Dali's here needs to have a certificate of authenticity, right? Since paintings like this are replicated everywhere, even in educational videos like this one. To show that we were looking at the original, authentic painting, the museum has even hung a certificate of authenticity beside the painting. This certificate will be our cue for Certolizumab, since certificate sounds like Certolizumab. It's the Certolizumab certificate. Finally, a painting as famous as this one needs a frame to match its prestige. And no material is better for showcasing art than a solid gold frame, since you always see these gold frames in museums and stuff, right? Anyway, the gold here will be your symbol for Golizumab, or Golizumab, the last drug we'll cover in this video. Gold for Golizumab, right? To sum up, the flick, Dali, certificate, and gold frame should remind you of Infliximab, Adalimumab, Certolizumab, and Golizumab, respectively. Keeping these symbols in mind, let's talk about how these drugs all work. As the fire starts to climb the wall, one of the museum curators brings a roll of tinfoil to protect the art from the heat, since you gotta use whatever you have on hand to smother the flames, right? Unfortunately, this guy stumbled in his hurry and dropped the tinfoil right to the ground. By the way, this tinfoil is our recurring symbol for TNF, since TNF stands for tinfoil, right? Well, actually, TNF stands for tumor necrosis factor, a potent inflammatory cytokine in the body. So this dropped tinfoil will help you remember that TNF levels are decreased or dropped by these drugs: Adalimumab, Golizumab, Certolizumab, and Infliximab. You see, these drugs act as antibodies against TNF in the body, binding the cytokine to prevent its action in the body. Since TNF has pro-inflammatory effects, blocking TNF here has anti-inflammatory effects. Let's get to our next symbol to reinforce this. In the curator's other hand is a fire extinguisher that he is using to put out the flames. This fire extinguisher, putting out the inflammatory flames, is our recurring symbol for anti-inflammatory action. You see, all these drugs are anti-inflammatory agents used to treat autoimmune diseases like inflammatory bowel disease, ankylosing spondylitis, psoriasis, as well as rheumatoid arthritis. Since inflammation is the cause of tissue injury in these diseases, blocking this inflammation can actually improve the clinical course of patients. Just remember that these drugs are used to treat autoinflammatory diseases. Got that? Before we close, we should mention a few low-yield side effects. The first is relatively nonspecific, which is GI upset. This is almost never going to help you pick these drugs out of a list of choices, so we're not going to dwell too long here. The next is immunosuppression, which you should be able to reason through. TNF causes inflammation, which is a part of the body's natural immune response against foreign pathogens. Since these drugs suppress TNF activity and autoimmune conditions, it should make sense that they suppress the immune system. It's not rocket science, folks. Finally, because these are antibody drugs, that means that these are actually biologic proteins that are injected into the body, which circulate in the serum of our bloodstream. As such, these proteins can cause serum sickness, which is just a fancy way of saying our immune system can develop antibodies against the drug antibodies itself, which bind to the drug to form immune complexes, which then deposit to cause local inflammation. This is a relatively nonspecific finding, since any antibody drug can induce serum sickness. Just remember that these drugs are biologic agents, and you should be able to reason through this one on test day. And that's all for this scene on TNF inhibitors. Let's quickly summarize what we've learned. Infliximab, Adalimumab, Certolizumab, and Golizumab are monoclonal antibodies against TNF alpha. They work by blocking TNF alpha's effects in the body, suppressing inflammation and damage caused by autoimmune diseases. Clinically, these drugs are used to treat autoinflammatory conditions like IBD, psoriasis, ankylosing spondylitis, and others. Side effects of these drugs include GI upset, serum sickness, and immunosuppression. Alright, let's go put out this fire before your test scores get too hot to handle. See you in the next one.